In the shadow of ancient mountains, in the hidden valleys where time seems to move differently, in the sacred spaces that exist between the visible world and the invisible realms, there stand structures so old, so carefully constructed, so deliberately hidden from ordinary perception that their true purpose has been lost to history. These are the dragon temples, the ancient sanctuaries that were built not as monuments to power or as places of worship for distant gods, but as sacred refuges, as places of protection and preservation for women of extraordinary consciousness, women who carried within them knowledge and power that the patriarchal world could not tolerate. These temples were built by those who understood that certain women possessed gifts that transcended the ordinary, that these women carried within them the consciousness of the divine feminine, that their survival and their freedom were essential for the continuation of human consciousness itself. This is the story of the women the dragon temples were built to protect, of why they were so dangerous to the systems of control, and of how their legacy is awakening in the hearts and minds of women across the world today. The story begins in a time so ancient that it exists more in the realm of consciousness than in the realm of historical fact. In this time, there were women who possessed abilities that seemed to transcend the ordinary laws of nature. These women could perceive dimensions of reality that were invisible to most human beings. They could access knowledge that had not been taught to them through conventional means. They could heal with a touch, could see into the future, could communicate with beings that existed in other dimensions of consciousness. These women were not witches or demons, as the patriarchal religions would later claim. They were priestesses, initiates, carriers of ancient wisdom, expressions of the divine feminine consciousness that had been preserved through the ages. These women understood the nature of consciousness. They understood that reality was not fixed and unchangeable, but was constantly being created through the choices and the awareness of conscious beings. They understood that the divine feminine was the primary principle of creation, the source from which all things emerged. They understood that the awakening of consciousness required the integration of the masculine and feminine principles, but with the recognition that the feminine was the primary principle, the source of all creation. But there came a time when the patriarchal consciousness began to emerge, when the masculine principle began to assert its dominance, when the knowledge of the divine feminine began to be suppressed. And those who understood the truth, those who recognized that the women who carried this knowledge were essential for the continuation of human consciousness, made a decision. They would build sanctuaries, sacred temples dedicated to the dragon, the ancient symbol of the divine feminine power. These temples would serve as places of refuge for the women who carried the knowledge, places where they could preserve their wisdom, places where they could continue their sacred work, even as the patriarchal world worked to suppress them. The dragon temples were not built in obvious places. They were built in hidden valleys, in remote mountains, in caves that could only be accessed by those who possessed the knowledge of how to find them. They were built with sacred geometry, with symbols that encoded the knowledge of the divine feminine, with chambers that were designed to amplify and preserve the consciousness of those who worked within them. The women who lived in these temples were not isolated or cut off from the world. Rather, they worked actively to guide the evolution of human consciousness. They established networks of communication with other initiates, other women who understood the truth and who were committed to its preservation. They worked to ensure that the knowledge would not be completely lost, that it would be passed down through generations, that it would be available when the time came for humanity to awaken. These women understood something that the patriarchal religions would never acknowledge, that the suppression of the divine feminine was creating an imbalance in human consciousness that would eventually lead to crisis and destruction. They understood that the patriarchal consciousness, left unchecked, would eventually destroy itself and everything around it. And they worked from within the dragon temples to preserve the knowledge and the consciousness that would be needed for the healing and transformation of humanity when the time came. The story of the recovery of the knowledge of the dragon temples and the women they were built to protect in the modern world begins with a woman named Sekhmet, a woman who carries within her the consciousness of the ancient priestesses, who is living through the experience of awakening in her own life. Sekhmet is a scholar, a mystic, a woman who has dedicated her entire life to the study of ancient sacred sites, to the decoding of hidden symbols, to the understanding of the deeper truths that lay beneath the surface of official history. Sekhmet had always felt drawn to the ancient temples, drawn to the mystery of what they truly represented, drawn to the knowledge that their true purpose had been deliberately hidden or distorted. She had spent decades researching, studying the architecture of ancient temples, comparing the symbols that appeared in different cultures, looking for evidence of a pattern, for clues about what the temples had truly been built to protect. She had discovered that certain temples appeared across different cultures and different time periods, temples that were dedicated to the dragon or the serpent, temples that were built in remote locations, temples that seemed to serve no obvious religious or political purpose. She had discovered that these temples contained symbols that were consistent across different cultures, symbols that seemed to encode knowledge about the divine feminine, about the nature of consciousness, about the path of spiritual awakening. It was during an expedition to a remote mountain temple, a place that had been hidden from the world for centuries, that Sekhmet received a vision that would change the course of her life. In this vision, she found herself in the presence of the ancient priestesses themselves, women of immense wisdom and power who had lived in the dragon temples, who had worked to preserve the knowledge of the divine feminine, who had guided the evolution of human consciousness through the ages. "You have been called," the priestesses said to her, their voices resonating with the authority of ages and the tenderness of infinite compassion. "You have been chosen because you carry within you the consciousness of those who came before you, because you have the capacity to understand what others cannot perceive, because you are willing to pay the price that understanding demands. The time has come for the truth about the dragon temples to be revealed. The time has come for the world to understand who we were, why the temples were built, what we were protecting, and what our legacy means for the awakening of consciousness in your time. And you have been prepared your entire life for this moment." Sekhmet emerged from this vision transformed. She understood that she had been given access to knowledge that had been hidden for thousands of years, knowledge that could reshape the entire understanding of human history and human spirituality. She understood that her role was to help restore the truth, to help humanity awaken to the reality that lay beneath the lies that had been constructed. She began to research with new urgency, looking for evidence of the dragon temples in the historical record, in the archaeological evidence, in the fragmentary accounts that had survived despite centuries of suppression. She discovered that the dragon temples had existed in many different locations across the world. She discovered evidence of them in the mountains of Asia, in the remote valleys of Europe, in the deserts of Africa, in the hidden places of the Americas. She discovered that the temples had been built according to specific principles of sacred geometry, that they had been constructed to amplify and preserve certain frequencies of consciousness. She discovered that the women who had lived in these temples had been trained in specific practices and disciplines that allowed them to access and work with these frequencies of consciousness. She discovered that the dragon temples had served multiple purposes. They had been places of refuge for women who possessed extraordinary abilities, places where they could develop their gifts without fear of persecution. They had been centers of learning where the knowledge of the divine feminine had been preserved and transmitted. They had been places of power where the women who lived there worked actively to guide the evolution of human consciousness. She discovered that the women who had lived in the dragon temples had not been isolated from the world. Rather, they had worked through networks of initiates, through secret societies, through mystical traditions, to ensure that the knowledge would be preserved and transmitted. She discovered that many of the great spiritual teachers, many of the prophets and seers who had appeared throughout history, had been trained in the dragon temples or had received teaching from women who had been trained there. She discovered that the suppression of the dragon temples had been deliberate and systematic. The patriarchal religions had worked to destroy the temples, to kill or suppress the women who lived in them, to erase the knowledge that they had preserved. She discovered that many of the temples had been destroyed, that many of the women had been killed or forced to flee, that the knowledge had been driven underground. She discovered that the suppression of the dragon temples and the women they protected had created a fundamental imbalance in human consciousness, an imbalance that had led to the domination and exploitation of all beings, to the destruction of the natural world, to the creation of systems of power that were based on control and domination rather than on love and cooperation. Sekhmet began to work with other researchers and spiritual teachers who had also recognized the truth about the dragon temples, who understood that the suppression of this knowledge had had profound consequences for human consciousness and human civilization, who were committed to the revelation of the truth to humanity. Together, they began to decode the symbols, to understand the architecture, to recognize how the knowledge had been preserved in hidden forms within the temples themselves. They discovered that the dragon temples had been built with specific chambers that were designed to facilitate different types of spiritual work. They discovered that the temples contained libraries of knowledge, encoded in stone and symbol, that could be read by those who possessed the understanding to perceive them. They discovered that the temples had been designed to work with the natural energies of the earth, to amplify and preserve the consciousness of those who worked within them. They discovered that the women who had lived in the dragon temples had possessed knowledge about the nature of consciousness, about the principles that governed the evolution of awareness, about the practices and disciplines that could facilitate the awakening of consciousness. They discovered that this knowledge had been carefully preserved, encoded in various forms, hidden within the temples themselves. They discovered that the dragon temples had not been built only for the women who lived in them, but had been built as beacons, as places of power that could guide the evolution of consciousness across the entire planet. They discovered that the temples had been connected to each other through networks of energy and consciousness, that they had worked together as a unified system to preserve and transmit the knowledge of the divine feminine. If you want a practical, step-by-step explanation of the path of knowledge we're exploring here today, I've created a complete guide to help you apply it in your own life. You'll find the link in the description. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to know. Sekhmet spent years developing a comprehensive teaching that would help others understand the dragon temples, that would guide them toward the recognition of the women who had lived in them, that would help them understand that the legacy of these women was awakening in the consciousness of women across the world today. She wrote books that were published under various names. She created videos and online courses. She established networks of practitioners who were working together to awaken to the consciousness of the dragon temples and to help others do the same. She worked with women from all walks of life, showing them how the legacy of the priestesses who had lived in the dragon temples was alive within them, how the knowledge that had been preserved in the temples was awakening in their own consciousness. She worked with researchers and archaeologists, showing them how to recognize the evidence of the dragon temples in the archaeological record, how to understand the symbols that had been encoded in the temples, how to appreciate the sophistication and the wisdom of the women who had built and maintained them. She worked with spiritual teachers from different traditions, showing them how the knowledge of the dragon temples appeared in their own traditions, how their own traditions had preserved fragments of the ancient wisdom, how the awakening that was happening in the present moment was the fulfillment of what the priestesses of the dragon temples had worked toward. But as Sekhmet's work became more widely known, she began to encounter resistance. There were those within academic institutions who saw her work as a threat, who feared that the revelation of the dragon temples would undermine their authority and their control over the interpretation of history. There were those within religious institutions who saw her work as a threat, who feared that the revelation of the truth about the women the temples protected would undermine their authority and their control. And there were more subtle forms of resistance as well. Sekhmet began to experience strange phenomena, synchronicities that seemed designed to test her commitment, challenges that appeared to be obstacles but which were actually initiations, opportunities to deepen her understanding and her faith in the truth that she had been given. But Sekhmet understood that this resistance was itself a sign of the truth of what she had discovered. The fact that there was such desperate opposition to the revelation of the dragon temples and the women they protected only confirmed that something of immense power and significance was indeed occurring, that the suppressed knowledge was indeed beginning to emerge into human consciousness. She also came to understand something profound about the nature of the women the dragon temples were built to protect. She understood that these women were not exceptional in the sense of being different from other women, but were exceptional in the sense of having awakened to their full potential, of having recognized and developed the gifts that existed within all women. She understood that the dragon temples had been built to protect not just the women who lived in them, but to preserve the knowledge and the consciousness that would eventually awaken in all women. She understood that the awakening of women to their true nature and their true power was not something that was happening only in the present moment, but was something that had been prepared for thousands of years, something that the priestesses of the dragon temples had worked toward, something that was the fulfillment of their sacred work. In her final years, Sekhmet worked to synthesize all of the knowledge she had gathered, to create a comprehensive teaching that would serve as a guide for understanding the dragon temples and the women they were built to protect. She wrote a final book that was intended to be her magnum opus, a complete guide to recognizing the evidence of the dragon temples, understanding the women who lived in them, and recognizing one's own connection to their legacy. When Sekhmet died, her work lived on. The knowledge she had preserved and transmitted continued to spread, reaching people in every corner of the world. More and more people began to understand that the dragon temples had existed, that they had been built to protect women of extraordinary consciousness, that the legacy of these women was awakening in the present moment. And in our own time, we are witnessing the awakening of the legacy of the dragon temples in unprecedented ways. We are seeing women rising to claim their power and their voice. We are seeing the recognition of the divine feminine as the primary principle. We are seeing the collapse of institutions that had been built on the suppression of the women the dragon temples protected. We are seeing the emergence of new forms of spirituality and community that honor the sacred feminine and the wisdom of the ancient priestesses. The dragon temples are no longer hidden. The women they were built to protect are being recognized. The knowledge they preserved is being revealed. And those who are ready to receive this knowledge, who are willing to open their hearts and minds to the wisdom of the ancient priestesses, who are committed to the awakening of the divine feminine within themselves and within all beings, are being called to step forward to recognize their role in the great work of transformation. The dragon temples were built to protect women who carried the consciousness of the divine feminine. They were built as sanctuaries, as places of power, as centers of learning, where the knowledge of the divine feminine could be preserved and transmitted. And now, in our time, the legacy of these temples and the women they protected is awakening in the consciousness of all humanity. The question that is being posed to each of us is this: will you recognize the legacy of the dragon temples within yourself? Will you awaken to the consciousness of the women they were built to protect? Will you help to guide others toward the recognition of this ancient wisdom? Will you participate in the transformation of human consciousness that will honor and celebrate the sacred feminine that the dragon temples were built to preserve? The dragon temples are calling. The women they protected are awakening. The ancient wisdom is being revealed, and the healing and transformation of all creation is beginning. The time of suppression is ending. The time of revelation is beginning, and you are invited to become part of this great awakening, to claim your role in the restoration of the knowledge the dragon temples preserved, to help guide humanity toward the recognition of the divine feminine that will reshape all creation. And if you liked this story, you will definitely love the next one that's appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and activate the notifications. See you in the next one.